God damn it! What the hell do you think you're doing? The voice cracked through the nursery like broken glass. 48-year-old Christopher Hale, a ruthless millionaire known for building empires out of other men's failures, stormed into the room. His silk tie hung loose, his fist clenched. On the floor, curled on a thin blanket, sat Elena Cruz, the maid. In her arms was his daughter, a baby girl who had finally stopped crying after hours of restless wails. "You filthy, disgusting thing," he spat, yanking the baby from her chest. "You serve her, you watch her, but you never touch her. Do you hear me? Never." The baby screamed instantly, her small fists clawing at the air. Her sobs turned shrill, almost panicked. Christopher tried to hush her, rocking awkwardly. "Shh. It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here." But the more he tried, the louder she cried. His face tightened. Sweat collected at his temple. "Why won't she stop?" he muttered. Elena's voice, low but firm, cut through the chaos. "She only sleeps in my arms, sir. Give her back." For a moment, Hale froze. Millionaires weren't supposed to look uncertain, but something flickered behind his eyes. Confusion, defeat, fear. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he handed the child back. The result was instant. Within seconds, the cries fell into soft hiccups. The baby buried her face against Elena's chest, breathing out the fragile sigh of a child who had found safety. Christopher stood rooted to the spot, watching the impossible unfold. His empire could silence competitors. His fortune could buy silence. But not even his wealth could stop the trembling of his own daughter, except in the arms of a maid. And for the first time in years, the millionaire felt powerless. If you like stories that begin with shocking truths and unravel secrets behind the walls of power, please subscribe and comment. If you don't like it, just leave a like. It helps more than you think. Because tonight, in that cold mansion, something had shifted, and Christopher Hale knew nothing in his world would ever be the same again. Christopher Hale didn't sleep that night. The house was silent, but not peaceful. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of his daughter, screaming in his arms, then going quiet the moment Elena touched her. It gnawed at him, a cruel reminder that money could buy him everything except the trust of his own child. By morning, the tension in the mansion was unbearable. At breakfast, his coffee went cold, untouched. His shirt collar was uneven, something unthinkable for a man obsessed with control. Across the long oak table, Elena moved quietly, her gaze fixed on the tray of folded blankets she carried. She didn't expect him to say a word, and he didn't. But the second night shattered whatever denial remained. Elena had tucked the baby in and stepped out. Within minutes, the cries began, piercing, relentless, echoing through the walls like a siren. Mrs. Dalton, the head housekeeper, rushed in. Nothing worked. Hale tried, his arms stiff and trembling, but the baby only screamed louder. It wasn't until Elena returned, whispering softly, arms outstretched, that the cries fell silent. The baby clung to her instantly as though she'd been waiting. Hale stood in the doorway, paralyzed. For a man who had spent decades mastering boardrooms, who had crushed rivals with a single decision, this scene struck him harder than any hostile takeover. His empire didn't matter. His words didn't matter. The child's choice was undeniable. She chose Elena. The third night, he didn't even try. Instead, he lingered outside the nursery door, listening. No wailing, no desperation. Only a quiet lullaby hummed through the half-open door. The sound was haunting, tender, unpolished, and powerful. He raised his hand, knocked gently. "Come in," Elena whispered, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind her. For a moment, Hale's voice faltered. Then he forced the words out. "I owe you an apology." Elena's expression didn't change. "For what?" "For how I spoke to you. For what I said. It was cruel and wrong." She nodded once, not forgiving, not condemning, just acknowledging. Her voice was steady, almost too steady. "She doesn't care about your fortune, Mr. Hale. She doesn't know the word millionaire. All she knows is warmth. All she needs is safety." His jaw tightened. He looked down. "I know. And I don't think she's the only one who does." The admission hung in the air like a fracture in marble. Elena didn't respond. Instead, she said simply, "I'm not going to quit. Not because of you, but because she needs me. Hale's eyes lifted. I hope you stay for her. For her, Elena repeated. But deep in her chest, something stirred, something she thought had been locked away for years. The following days passed like shifting shadows. Hale found himself watching more than speaking. At the dining table, he noticed Elena's movements, measured, deliberate, always careful not to take up too much space. He noticed the way his daughter reached for her, tiny hands grasping for the only constant she recognized. And he noticed something else, the silence. For years, his mansion had been filled with a suffocating quiet, the kind that buried laughter before it reached the walls. But now, at odd hours, there was a sound he hadn't heard in forever. A baby's giggle, a hum, sometimes even soft laughter from Elena herself. One evening, while Elena was folding towels in the laundry room, Hale's voice carried down the corridor. He was on the phone. I told you I'm not interested in dinner meetings right now, he snapped. Then softer. Because I have a daughter who cries through the night unless a stranger holds her. And I can't even look that stranger in the eye because I treated her like she was nothing. Elena froze in the doorway, breath caught. There was a pause. Then Hale's voice, quieter than she'd ever heard it. She's not just the help. I see that now, but I don't know how to fix it. The door creaked accidentally under Elena's hand. Hale turned. Their eyes met. A silence stretched, heavy, electric. You weren't supposed to hear that, he muttered stiffly. No one's ever supposed to hear anything in this house, Elena replied calmly. It's made of silence. His shoulders sagged. I meant what I said. Last night, this morning. I was wrong. I was cruel. Elena's gaze stayed on him, firm but not cruel. That baby knows who's gentle, and right now, she only trusts me. I'd like to start over, Hale said. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past him, up the stairs and into the nursery. Moments later, the lullaby began again. And downstairs, for the first time in his life, Christopher Hale, the millionaire who thought he controlled everything, sat alone realizing the truth. Some things can't be bought, threatened, or negotiated. They can only be earned, and he wasn't sure he knew how. Christopher Hale had always believed he understood power. Power was numbers, contracts, signatures on paper. Power was the hush that fell over a boardroom when he entered, the trembling of competitors when they realized he had already outmaneuvered them. But in the weeks that followed, he learned power could be something else entirely. Fragile, wordless, terrifying. Power was a baby who only slept in the arms of a maid. Power was silence, broken not by money, but by a lullaby whispered in the dark. Every night, Christopher found himself lingering near the nursery. He told himself it was coincidence, but the truth gnawed at him. He wanted to hear the quiet hum of Elena's song, to know that his daughter was safe. And each time as he stood outside the door, the fortress of certainty he had built around himself cracked a little more. The mansion itself began to change. For years, its marble floors had been polished into lifeless mirrors, its rooms echoing with the kind of silence that mocked whoever dared to breathe. Now there were different sounds, Elena's soft voice soothing the child, Lily's sudden giggles, even faint laughter echoing in the hallways. Mrs. Dalton noticed first. She whispered to Christopher one morning as he sat stiffly at the breakfast table, his tie crooked, his coffee untouched. She only sleeps with her, the older woman murmured, almost reverent. Christopher didn't reply. He didn't know how. The staff felt the shift, too. They had long endured their employer's cold detachment, his reputation as a man who saw people as assets or liabilities. But the way he glanced, hesitant, almost human, toward the maid who carried his daughter spoke volumes no boardroom ever had. One evening, he finally found the courage to speak again. Elena, he began awkwardly, leaning against the nursery doorframe. She didn't look up from the crib. Yes, sir. I meant what I said that night, about starting over. She adjusted the blanket around the sleeping baby, her hands steady. Starting over doesn't erase the past. I know, Christopher admitted, his voice softer than he intended. But I want to try. For the first time, Elena looked at him directly. Her eyes were neither warm nor cruel, only steady. This isn't about you, Mr. Hale. It's about her. She doesn't care if you're a millionaire. She just needs someone who won't leave. The words cut deeper than any shareholder's betrayal. He nodded once, retreating without argument. Days blurred into weeks. The routines in the house settled into something almost ordinary. Christopher began taking breakfast not in his office, but in the dining room, if only to catch a glimpse of his daughter smiling as Elena carried her down the stairs. One morning he found himself asking, "What did you want to be when you were younger?" Elena blinked at the question. "Before I learned the world doesn't give chances to girls like me." She shrugged faintly. "A nurse, maybe a teacher." Then neither. Life had other plans. "You do more than fold laundry," Christopher said quietly. She raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to be a compliment." "Yes." To his surprise, she smiled, a small, reluctant thing. And for a man who had lived in rooms filled with hollow laughter, that smile felt heavier than applause. Then came the storm, the kind not measured in thunder or rain, but in the sound of a doorbell. It was a Saturday morning when the chime echoed through the grand foyer. Christopher opened the door himself, something he rarely did. And there she stood, Clara Morgan, tall, elegant, wrapped in a caramel coat. Her hair fell in perfect curls, her perfume sharp as memory. "Christopher," she breathed, her smile trembling. He stiffened. "Clara!" Behind him, Elena appeared, Lily perched on her hip. The child's curls bounced as she shifted, clinging tightly to the maid's shirt. Clara's eyes locked on her daughter, wide and wet. "She's gotten so big," Clara whispered. "May I?" The room froze. Elena's arms tightened instinctively around the child. For a moment, no one moved. Then Christopher stepped forward, voice heavy. "Let me." He took Lily carefully from Elena's arms. The baby whimpered, uneasy but not yet crying. Clara extended her hands. Christopher passed her over. For a fleeting second, it looked like a photograph, a mother reunited with her child. Clara whispered, "Mommy's here." But then it shattered. Lily's whimper turned into a wail, her body stiffening, her tiny arms flailing. Clara rocked her desperately, whispering please, but the cries only grew louder, frantic, breathless. And then Elena moved. "Lily," she whispered, reaching out. The baby reached back without hesitation. The moment Elena held her, the screams broke into hiccups, then silence. Lily buried her face in Elena's chest as if the world outside didn't exist. Clara froze. Her voice cracked. She doesn't know me. She knows who stayed," Elena said softly. The words were simple, but they echoed like a verdict. Clara's shoulders slumped. She turned to Christopher, her eyes brimming. "I shouldn't have come." "You wanted to see her," he said carefully. "I thought it would feel different." Clara's gaze shifted to Elena. "But you already have a family." Elena swallowed hard. "I didn't expect me either." Clara nodded once, broken. "I don't know where I belong anymore." Christopher's voice was steady. "That's not something I can answer for you." With one last glance at the child, sleeping now in Elena's arms, Clara whispered, "She's happy. I didn't think I'd be relieved by that, but I am." And then she was gone. The silence she left behind was heavier than her presence. Hours later, Christopher found Elena in the nursery, rocking Lily gently. He hesitated at the door. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he said quietly. Elena didn't look at him. "But it did, and she chose." His throat tightened. "I'm afraid I don't know how to be a father." "Neither do I," she admitted. Then her voice softened. "But maybe we're learning. Together." He stepped closer, his eyes raw. "And what are we to each other, Elena?" She looked up at him, steady as always. "We're the ones who didn't run." And for the first time in decades, Christopher Hale, the millionaire who thought he could buy permanence, understood the truth. Family wasn't built on wealth or blood. It was built on presence, on staying. The following weeks carried a fragile peace. Lily laughed more, slept longer, her eyes lighting up whenever Elena entered the room. Christopher found himself drawn into routines he'd never known. Family breakfasts, quiet evenings in the nursery, even small conversations that didn't end in silence. Yet under the calm, something stirred. Rumors in the company, whispers of betrayal in his empire. Men who had once feared him now waited for a weakness to exploit. And what greater weakness could there be than a millionaire whose heart was no longer guarded by steel, but tethered to a maid and a child? Christopher didn't know it yet, but the battle for his fortune and for the fragile family he was just beginning to build was about to begin. The days after Clara's visit were strangely quiet, too quiet. The mansion, once echoing with Lily's cries, now carried only the soft rhythm of laughter. The child slept longer, played more, her tiny hands reaching for Elena before anyone else. Christopher Hale found himself drawn into this new rhythm: family breakfasts, evening walks through the garden, lullabies at night. But beneath the fragile calm, a storm was brewing. And it wasn't inside the nursery, it was inside his empire. One Monday morning, as Christopher prepared to leave for headquarters, Mrs. Dalton handed him the day's financial reports. His sharp eyes scanned the numbers. A small frown formed. "3 million unaccounted for," he muttered. "Yes, sir," she replied cautiously. "The auditors noticed inconsistencies. They thought you should know first." Christopher's chest tightened. Inconsistencies. He knew the word well. In his world, it meant betrayal. At the office, the whispers were louder. A department head avoided his gaze. An executive shuffled papers too quickly. And in the boardroom, one man sat with an unsettling calm. Richard Vaughn, his chief financial officer. Vaughn had been with him for nearly a decade, a man whose smile was as polished as his cufflinks. He spoke softly, but his influence reached far. And now Christopher saw it clearly. Vaughn wasn't nervous, he was waiting. That evening, Elena was in the laundry room folding linens when she heard voices drifting down the hallway. She froze at the mention of a name. "She's dangerous," Vaughn was saying on the phone. "The maid. He listens to her. The girl's practically running the household. If she starts speaking about the finances, we're finished." Elena's blood ran cold. She leaned closer. "No," Vaughn continued. "He won't see it coming. By the time Hale realizes, the board will already have my numbers. And the maid? She'll be gone." The words struck like glass shattering in her chest. She returned to the nursery, shaken, clutching Lily tighter than usual. Christopher noticed. "What happened?" She hesitated, then said softly, "You need to be careful. Someone close to you, he's planning something." Christopher studied her face, the fear in her eyes. "Who?" Her lips parted, but she stopped. "Not yet. Not until I'm certain." 2 weeks later, it happened. Christopher walked into a board meeting only to be met with silence. Vaughn slid a file across the glossy table. "Misappropriated funds," Vaughn said smoothly. "Millions, shifted into shell companies, all under your signature." Christopher's jaw tightened. "That's impossible." But the papers were there. His name, his codes, his approval. Forged, but flawless. The board members exchanged glances, some skeptical, some eager. The scent of blood was in the air. "This company cannot withstand another scandal," Vaughn said, his voice calm but deadly. "For the sake of Grayson Holdings, perhaps it's time for a transition." Christopher realized then, this wasn't a warning. This was a coup. That night, Christopher returned home later than ever, his face pale with rage. Elena was rocking Lily in the nursery when he finally spoke. "They're trying to take everything," he whispered. She looked at him carefully. "And you're letting them?" His head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "You built an empire," she said, her voice steady. "But the moment someone forged a paper, you falter. Do you even hear yourself? The man who terrifies a boardroom can't even defend his own name?" The words hit like a slap. But then she added softly, "You're not powerless. Not unless you choose to be." For a long moment, Christopher said nothing. Then he sat down beside her, his voice low. "They forged everything, Elena. The papers, the transfers, and the board. They want to believe it, because they've wanted me gone for years." "Then show them who you are," she said. "Not with money, with truth." Elena didn't sleep that night. Instead, she returned to the laundry room, the very place she had overheard Vaughn. She searched through discarded files, old ledgers, anything she could find. And then, buried in a stack of shredded receipts, she saw it. A name. A shell company registered in Vaughn's wife's maiden name. Her heart pounded. She took the evidence straight to Christopher. He looked at it, his eyes widening. You found this? She nodded. He's sloppy. He thought no one would look where only maids go. For the first time, Christopher smiled. Not his cold, calculated smile, but something else. Respect. The next morning, the boardroom was silent as Christopher entered. Vaughn smirked, ready to watch him fall. But this time, Hale wasn't alone. Elena stood by the door holding a folder. Christopher's voice was calm. You accuse me of theft. But tell me, Vaughn, why does every dollar you claim I stole lead back to your wife's name? He slid the documents across the table. Vaughn's face drained of color. This is fabricated, Vaughn spat. Is it? Christopher countered, his voice sharp as steel. Because my maid found what your auditors missed. Or maybe they didn't miss it at all. Maybe they were bought. Gasps filled the room. Elena's presence was undeniable. She wasn't just the help, she was the witness. Vaughn stammered. You can't prove, but Christopher cut him off. I don't need to prove it here. Federal investigators will. 2 security guards stepped in. Vaughn's smirk crumbled. As he was escorted out, he hissed, You'll regret this, both of you. Christopher didn't flinch. No, Vaughn, I regret trusting you. The board was shaken, but the tide had turned. Whispers shifted from scandal to admiration. Some even dared to look at Elena with something like respect. That night back in the mansion, Christopher found her in the nursery, humming softly to Lily. He leaned against the doorway, his voice low. You saved me. Elena shook her head. I saved her. And by saving her, maybe I saved you too. He stepped closer, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. I don't say this lightly, Elena, but I trust you, more than anyone. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself feel the warmth in his words. But trust was a dangerous thing. She had learned that the hard way. Still, when she looked down at Lily, sleeping peacefully, her tiny hand wrapped around Elena's finger, she knew one thing was certain. They were no longer just Maid and Millionaire. They were something else, something fragile, terrifying, and unstoppable. The Empire had survived one battle, but whispers still lingered. The board wasn't united, and enemies waited in the shadows. Elena knew it wasn't over, and as she stood at the nursery window, watching the city lights flicker like restless stars, she whispered to herself, They'll come again. And next time, they won't stop at money. Behind her, Christopher's voice answered, steady and resolute. Then we faced them, together. And in that moment, the maid who had once been invisible and the millionaire who had once been untouchable understood the same truth. The real war had only just begun. The boardroom victory against Richard Vaughn had been decisive, but it left shadows behind. For days, whispers crawled through the marble halls of Grayson Holdings. Reporters lingered outside the glass doors. Investors called at dawn, asking if Christopher Hale was truly back in control, or if his empire was just bleeding slower than before. At home, the mansion felt different, safe for now, but Elena sensed it too. The air carried a fragile weight, like glass waiting to shatter. Christopher spent his mornings in the study, hunched over contracts and legal briefs. He was a man used to commanding armies of lawyers, yet now he worked in silence, pen scratching like a soldier patching his own wounds. Elena sometimes brought him coffee, setting it down gently. He never asked, but he always looked up, eyes lingering, as if the warmth of the mug mattered less than the warmth of her presence. You don't have to fight this alone, she said once. He gave a small, humorless laugh. A millionaire who can't handle his own battles? That would make the headlines sweeter for them. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore, Elena replied, her gaze steady. You're fighting for her. She nodded toward the nursery. Christopher's throat tightened. For the first time in years, he didn't argue. Lily had grown bolder since Vaughn's departure. She toddled through the halls, tiny curls bouncing, giggling when she found Elena's hand or Christopher's tie. She spoke in small words, but the truth was clear. She trusted. One evening, as Christopher tried to rock her to sleep, she stretched her arms toward Elena. He hesitated, pain flickering in his eyes, but Elena shook her head. She needs to know you're not going anywhere, she whispered. His jaw clenched. What if I can't? You can. You already are. He held his daughter tighter. This time she didn't cry. And when she finally drifted into sleep, her tiny fist clutched his shirt instead of Elena's. The sight nearly broke him. Later that night, Christopher stood on the balcony, staring at the city's restless lights. Elena joined him, arms crossed against the cool air. "She trusts you now," Elena said softly. "She trusts you more," he replied. Elena's lips curved faintly. "Maybe she trusts both of us." For a long silence, they simply watched the skyline. Then Christopher's voice dropped, rough, almost afraid. "I used to think money could buy permanence, that if I built something strong enough, no one could take it away. But Vaughn proved me wrong. And you—" He stopped. "And me?" Elena asked. "You proved I was looking in the wrong place." His eyes met hers, unguarded. "It's not the company that keeps me alive. It's the fact that you stayed." Elena's chest ached. She wanted to tell him that staying hadn't been simple, that survival was all she'd ever known. But instead she whispered, "I didn't stay for you. I stayed for her." He nodded. "I know, but I'm glad you did." Peace was fragile, and it cracked again one afternoon when Elena returned from the market to find a woman waiting at the gates. It was Clara Morgan. Her coat was simpler this time. Her makeup faded, but her presence was still sharp as glass. "I came to say goodbye," Clara said softly. "I'm leaving the city." Elena stiffened. "And why are you telling me?" Clara's gaze lowered. "Because I see now. She doesn't need me. She needs you." Elena blinked, stunned. Clara added, "Don't let him ruin it. Christopher, he destroys everything he touches. Don't let him destroy you." Elena's voice was calm, but her heart trembled. "He's trying. For her, for himself, and maybe for me." Clara gave a broken laugh. "Then you're stronger than I ever was." And with that, she turned and walked away, her figure swallowed by the city. Weeks passed. The scandal with Vaughn began to fade as federal investigators confirmed the fraud. For the first time in months, Christopher entered the boardroom not as a man under fire, but as a man leading the charge. And beside him, though never sitting at the table, was Elena. She waited in the wings, sometimes holding Lily, sometimes holding files she had quietly helped him review. She never asked for recognition, but Christopher began to give it anyway. At one meeting, when a gray-haired director questioned her presence, Christopher's voice cut through the air like steel. "She stays. She sees what none of you ever did. Without her, this company wouldn't be standing." Elena froze at the words. For a man who once told her she was nothing, it was an admission she never expected. One evening, as snow dusted the city, Elena sat in the nursery with Lily asleep in her arms. Christopher entered quietly, holding a small folder. "I want to show you something." Inside were plans for a new initiative, the Warm Floor Foundation. "A program for women who came from nothing," Christopher explained. "Single mothers, maids, caretakers, the ones no one sees. I want you to lead it." Elena stared at the pages, her throat tight. "Why me?" "Because you know what it feels like to be invisible, and you know what it means to be seen." Her hands trembled as she closed the folder. "This isn't about your name, Christopher. This has to be about mine." His gaze softened. "Then it will be. I'll support you, but it's yours." For the first time, Elena let herself imagine a future not just of survival, but of purpose. Spring came early. The mansion, once cold as stone, now carried the smell of fresh flowers, toys scattered across the floors, drawings taped to the walls. One Saturday morning, Elena was baking in the kitchen when Lily ran in, curls wild. "Mommy!" she cried, clutching Elena's legs. Elena froze. The word cut deep. She glanced up at Christopher, who stood in the doorway, his eyes wide. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. Tears stung Elena's eyes. "But I'm not—" "You're the one who stayed," Christopher interrupted gently. "Blood doesn't make family. Love does." Elena knelt, hugging the little girl tight. "Then I'll never leave you," she whispered. Christopher's voice was steady. "Neither will I." The empire was stabilizing. Vaughn was gone. The board was cautious but silent. And in the Hale mansion, life no longer echoed with silence, but with warmth. Yet Elena knew the world wouldn't stay quiet forever. The press still circled. The city still whispered, and somewhere beyond the walls, new challenges waited. But as she sat that evening by the nursery window, Lily asleep in her arms and Christopher beside her, Elena realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was building. And this time, she wasn't building alone. The weeks that followed carried a gentleness the house had never known. The marble halls, once echoing with silence, now held the laughter of a child, the steady footsteps of a man who no longer rushed past his own family, and the soft voice of a woman who had once been dismissed as invisible. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with shades of rose and gold, Elena sat in the nursery rocking Lily. The little girl's breathing slowed into a rhythm of peace, her tiny fingers still curled around Elena's braid. Christopher appeared in the doorway, his tie undone, his eyes softer than the city skyline behind him. "She sleeps better now," he whispered. "She's safe now," Elena replied, brushing a curl from the child's forehead. Christopher stepped into the room, resting a hand on the crib. For a long moment, they simply stood there. Two people from worlds that were never meant to collide, brought together not by blood or contract, but by a child's fragile trust. "Elena," he said quietly, "when I first saw you on this floor, I thought you were nothing, but now I know. You were everything I was missing." Her eyes met his, steady, unflinching. "You don't need to thank me, just promise you'll keep choosing her. Every day, even when it's hard." "I will," he said, "and not just her. You." The words lingered like a vow. In the months ahead, the warm floor foundation opened its doors. Women who had once been unseen walked in with hesitant steps, only to find warmth, dignity, and a reminder that survival was not the end. It was the beginning. Elena stood at the heart of it all, no longer the maid who slept on the floor, but the woman who built a legacy from it. Christopher was there too, not as the savior, but as the man who finally learned that true wealth is measured not in billions, but in the courage to stand beside those who were once overlooked. And little Lily? She grew up in a home filled not with silence, but with music, laughter, and the unshakable certainty that she was loved. This story is more than a tale of a maid and a millionaire. It is proof that family is not defined by fortune or blood, but by presence. That sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not in boardrooms or ballots, but in quiet nurseries, where love refuses to let go. If this story touched you, remember, there are unseen heroes everywhere, holding the world together with kindness no one notices. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we start noticing. If you like stories like this, please subscribe and comment. If you don't, just leave a like. It means more than you think. Because sometimes the smallest acts, like sleeping on the floor for a crying child, can awaken the greatest changes in us all.